Bom dia, Lisboa. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, after the previous talk about statelessness, I feel like taxation is not so important anymore, Pascal. Let's shift gear now with Pascal and our topic, what did it take to fix global tax? And have we actually fixed global tax? But first of all, Pascal, you've just left your previous job and are now in good new hands. I believe this is your first on-stage interview, so congratulations. Tell us first of all, why did you leave your OECD job?
Thank you. Good question, and good afternoon to you all. I left the OECD after 15 years of exhausting work to change the international tax system, and I left it because I think the job is largely done. There is still some work to do, but we have changed the international tax system. There is a new architecture which is going to be put in place in the coming months and coming years, but mission accomplished, I would say.
Congratulations, and well, 15 years in that job at the OECD, I guess, is not a short time period as well. Tell us just briefly what you're up to right now.
I'm up to joining a firm, Brunswick, and I will also take some academic responsibility in your country, in Switzerland, which will be announced soon as a professor of tax policy.
We might talk about taxation in Switzerland in a moment, but let's first of all talk about this milestone achievement. Last year, we reached a minimum tax rate of 15% for multinational companies with a turnover of more than 750 million euros. In retrospect, are you satisfied with that?
So it's been the work of more than 10 years. So for you to understand, international tax is the way governments, countries, sovereignties interact with each other. And the rules were designed 1 century ago by the League of Nations at the colonial time and so. And this system was broken. It was broken because we've had globalization, we have liberalization of the economy, and multinational companies could just shift their profits wherever they wanted, meaning in tax havens. So we've tried to fix that with a project launched in 2012 called Base Erosion Profit Shifting. And what we've completed last year with the support of the Biden administration, but also 140 countries, was the establishment of a global minimum tax of 15% for the large companies, turnover above 750 million, which puts an end to tax competition, or at least a floor to tax competition at 15% effective. It's not just a nominal rate. You take the tax, you take the financial consolidated profit, and it has to be at least 15%, which will secure revenue for governments and a level playing field for the competition between companies.
We have an audience of tech companies and a lot of startups as well. What do you think should be the future for them in terms of taxation?
So the issue of taxing companies, as you know probably in the room, and as you have experience, is that there is a lot of frustration. There has been a lot of frustration from governments because you can act with what we call scale without mass. You don't need to be in many countries to operate in many countries. And some very successful companies, we could name them, the French like saying the GAFA or the GAFAM. I mean, the largest companies have been able to derive massive revenue from some countries where they are not necessarily physically present. And these countries have expressed growing frustration, saying you're making profit out of the use of the data of the people contributing to the platform, but we don't see any profit located in our jurisdiction. And as a result, they have tried to fix the system. It didn't succeed back in 2015-16, and countries decided to act unilaterally, to take digital service taxes. As they couldn't tax the net profit, they decided to tax the gross transactions, which is not good, because the tax on gross revenue is unfair, is inefficient, and at the end of the day is to be paid by the consumers of the companies, those making the advertisement or the users of the company. As a result, you've had unilateral measures and trade tensions, because the Trump administration And that's a bipartisan issue in the US. The Democrats don't like these digital service taxes. And as a result, you had tensions, and the OECD was there to say, let's try to find a solution. And we did find the solution last year. That's the pillar one of the deal. The pillar two is about the minimum tax. The pillar one was about this reallocation of taxing right and new nexus. What does that mean? That a company, and not only the tech companies, also the companies interacting in a market, whatever their activity is, these companies will be taxed in the market through a formula. A percentage of their profit will be allocated to the market jurisdiction, whether they are physically present or not. And that's not for the startups in the room, for the largest companies in the world. When your turnover is above 20 billion euros and profitability above 10%. But that has an impact on tech companies as well.
And for the tech startups and the smaller companies, do you see those rules change as well, or will there be status quo for the foreseeable future?
For the companies which are below the threshold of 20 billion, I wish you were there. I guess you wish you were there too. But for these companies, no change except this global minimum tax and the fact that we have fixed the rules following the BEPS project, which means that the traditional schemes where you will have an Irish company to channel profit out of Europe in Bermuda, this is over. Past the US tax reform, past the BEPS project for base erosion profit shifting at the OECD, you can no longer do that. So you will have to be more compliant, you will have to leave more profits in the markets you are operating, but you will not be impacted by this new allocation of taxing right and new nexus, which means that you're taxable even if you're not physically present in a country.
Now, on a global scale, there is a lot going on at United Nations General Assembly as well. They want to draft a new resolution for a global tax body. Nigeria and a lot of African nations start to call for that. What's the latest there, and should there be a global tax body, first of all?
Well, actually, over the years, we've seen that international tax has been a very prominent topic for politicians. I mean, I've attended all the G20 leaders summits. The one I will be missing is in a couple of weeks in Bali. But I can tell you that when you are in the room with the leaders of the G20, and when you start talking about tax, I mean, they leave their phone and they pay attention. They're extremely interested with this because this has been the success story of the G20. Now, because the G20 includes countries which are not at the OECD, we at the OECD, we included these non-OECD G20 countries, China, Brazil, India, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, but also developing countries. And today, the work at the OECD on transparency, that's not the topic of the day, but as you may know, there is no more bank secrecy. I mean, shut down your bank accounts in Switzerland or in other countries because that's over, or if you keep them, it will be reported. So to do that work, we have 165 countries on an equal footing. That sounds like a global tax body. And to do the work, designing the international tax standards on multinational companies, we have 140 countries. So all these countries being on an equal footing to decide by consensus, meaning everybody has to agree on the rules. Now, the UN wants to come and play, fine, but it shouldn't be duplicative. If they can do something new, okay. You have a number of NGOs and activists saying, but the UN is fairer because you have everybody. Okay, fine, you may have another 40 countries, but you still have the US and the Europeans who will have to participate to consensus. So I think we need to be careful about the rhetoric of, oh, this is a legitimate body versus the OECD, which would be less legitimate. What matters is to deliver. We have delivered international standards. Companies are impacted. They are also contributing to the design of the rules through public consultation, and we're getting there. So what matters, instead of coming up with new rules, is to make sure that what was agreed last year is going to be implemented in the coming months, in the coming years. The minimum tax is happening now. The reallocation of profits and the new nexus for tech companies and beyond may take more time because it will require a multilateral convention that will have to be ratified by the US Senate with a 67 vote. Now, the very proposition sounds unlikely, and it's true it's a challenge, but I believe that at the end of the day, which may take a few months or a couple of years, it will happen.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for more tax cooperation, greater transparency, and so on. If you're really honest, Pascal, how many loopholes are there still? You know, how many criminals can still avoid taxes? How many multinationals, tech companies can still avoid taxation?
So I think that the system 15 years ago was completely broken. I mean, cheating on the taxman or taxwoman was an extremely easy game. It was not even illegal. The rules were broken.
It must have been fun as well.
Tax evasion, tax avoidance was absolutely massive. Yeah. We're talking here about hundreds of billions of euros of tax revenue lost every year, for companies as well as for individuals. For individuals, using bank secrecy, using fiduciary trusts and so, is over. Now, you always have criminals. But yesterday, it was not a criminal activity in the extent that you would go to Switzerland, to Zurich or to Geneva, open a bank account, shake hands with a banker, and be fine. It was fraud in the UK, in France, in the US, elsewhere, but not in Switzerland. Now, it's fraud everywhere. Now, if you are a human trafficker, a drug trafficker, a weapon trafficker, whatsoever, you will still hide, but this is criminal activity. You will have to give all your money to a lawyer, give it up, and face massive risks. If you are just about tax evasion, you don't do it, because the risk is too big. For multinational companies, the system was broken, we've repaired it, and with the global minimum tax at 15%, which is high, 15% effective is really what you pay. Today it's probably around 6-7%. It used to be at 0 to 1%. We're moving to 15% for international business, and you have to pay the local taxes. If you're an American company, you have to pay the 21% in the US. So are there some loopholes? Maybe some left here and there, but what matters is that we now have a safety net which will ensure this end of the race to the bottom.
Fingers crossed. A lot of these issues actually came to the surface because of the Paradise Papers in 2017, where around 100 multinational companies were trying to move 252 billion US dollars to some islands around the world. What is the latest on the Paradise Papers? They have somehow disappeared now.
So what's interesting is that Paradise Papers followed the Pandora's Papers, which followed the Panama Papers, which followed the LuxLeaks, which followed the Swiss leaks, which followed the Liechtenstein scandal. So we've seen that since 2007 and the Liechtenstein scandal, we've seen whistleblowers reporting things that they did consider, rightfully so, as not normal. And this has triggered public anger and political attention, which is why we have been able to drive change throughout these years. Now, you may think 15 years is a long time, but be aware that the new system will last 1 century, like the previous system lasted 1 century. What's interesting, and you said, is that since the Paradise Papers, which were probably 3 years ago, we haven't seen anything. Well, precisely because we have fixed the system. And the Paradise Papers themselves were just showing cases of criminals more than cases of tax avoiders. So compared to the Liechtenstein scandal, where you had thousands of people hiding their money massively, billions, hundreds of billions in Liechtenstein, this is over. And that's why I think we've seen the end of all these papers.
But tax havens still exist, I believe, right?
Well, not that much. I mean, you have some jurisdictions which try to attract investments by being competitive. Now with the floor at 15%, they can no longer offer zero tax, except for the companies below 750 million, if there is substance located in the jurisdictions. But I'm happy to say that tax havens, as we used to know them, which was complete opacity, bank secrecy, no beneficial ownership information available, zero taxation, no substance, like the British Virgin Islands, which used to offer 800,000 BVI companies, meaning companies with no substance, that's over. You will still have open economies, competitive economies, and that's fine. Singapore is one of them. Ireland, hello Paddy, is one of them. But now it's regulated, and I think we can no longer say that they are pure tax havens. Now, some of them may be poorly regulated. The implementation may not be there, and that's why at the OECD, in the inclusive framework, in the global forum, we've put in place peer review mechanisms to make sure that countries implement. And if they don't, then you have a threat, because all the money may go there, as was the case with Panama. I mean, Panama was a tough cookie until the Panama Papers back in 2016. They refused to implement, and we had to blacklist them. So if a country doesn't play by the rules, it has to suffer a risk of reputation, and blacklisting is the answer. But we don't have many blacklisted countries left, and certainly no major financial center left on the blacklist today.
No blacklisted countries left. Wow. Let's not just talk about corporates and countries, but also individuals and the rich of this world. Now, according to Forbes, there are around 3,311 billionaires in the world right now. They represent almost 11.8 trillion US dollars in wealth, and the global billionaire population continued to grow last year by 3%. So there are more and more rich people. And of course, the wealth gap is growing as well. Do you think that the billionaires and millionaires of this world should be taxed more?
That's a fair question, because you have more wealth on the one hand and more inequalities on the other hand. And that clearly is breaking the social contract. And you can see that with populism growing everywhere. Even the IMF or the OECD now are saying we need to bridge the gap of inequalities. And I think the real question there is about shifting back the burden, the tax burden, from capital taxation to labor taxation, from labor to capital. What we've had was some good level of capital taxation in the 80s, in the 70s, and this has shrunk, but who had to pay were labor force. So we've increased labor taxation to a point where we think we are at the breaking point, and what we need to do is shift back taxation to capital income. And I think the work we did to put an end to bank secrecy can help that move that we can see in some countries, but that's a real question. And I would end with the other question, which also relates to the high net worth individual, which is about carbon taxation. Who has to bear the cost of carbon pricing, which will have to come if we want to address climate change, is an important question we'll have to look at in the near future.
And now we have 2:10. The timer says our session is up. Thank you so much, Pascal, and good luck for your next job.
Thank you, Martina.
Thank you
all.